Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are plunging into a period of English history that was, well, anything but calm.
Definitely turbulent times.
We're exploring the reigns of three monarchs, Henry VII, Edward VI, and Mary VI, and we're drawing it all from a single source text you've shared with us.
That's right. It's quite a sweep, about 70 years or so, and this text packs in the power struggles, the religious upheaval, some really ambitious characters, too.
And their dramatic personal stories, all seen through the lens of this particular source.
Exactly.
So think of this deep dive as your essential shortcut. We're going to navigate this source together, pull out the key insights, the big shifts.
And some surprising details that really jump out from this text.
Right. Our mission to figure out what this source highlights as most important about this era.
So you get the crucial knowledge without having to sift through, well, everything yourself. Ready to jump in?
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the first Tudor king, Henry VII. His hold on the throne, according to our source, it wasn't exactly secure, was it?
No, far from it. The source really makes a point of emphasizing just how shaky his claim actually was.
It says he had several potential titles, but none were really solid, legally or politically.
Pretty much. His main claim was as the Lancastrian heir, but the source points out that the original Lancastrian claim itself, under Henry IV.
That was already pretty questionable.
Right, it had already disrupted the whole established system of hereditary right.
And adding to that, he wasn't even the direct Lancastrian heir himself.
Not really, no. The source suggests it was more the sheer determination of the Lancastrian faction. They just weren't willing to give up.
So they kind of adopted Henry the Earl of Richmond as their leader.
Yeah, mainly through his mother, Margaret, who had that Beaufort connection.
So he wins the throne on this, well, let's say legally and politically weak basis. What does the source say were the immediate challenges?
Well, unsurprisingly, pretenders popped up almost right away.
Yes, the pretenders.
The source highlights two main ones. Lambert's Simnel.
The baker's son impersonating the Earl of Warwick.
Exactly. And then Perkin Warbeck.
A Fleming claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, one of the princes in the Tower.
And what's really interesting, the source notes, is the support Warbeck got.
Significant foreign backing, wasn't it?
Yes, crucially from the Duchess of Burgundy, Margaret. She was actually Henry's aunt, but a fierce opponent. The source says she received him with great fanfare.
He even got French support initially.
He did, though that cooled off. But this international backing, it really underscores how fragile people thought Henry's position was.
And how does the source describe Henry's response to all this? Cautious.
Cautious, but resolute is the word used. He took deliberate steps.
Like trying to prove the real Duke of York was dead.
Exactly. The text details how he interviewed the people Richard III had supposedly hired for the murder, trying to get definitive proof.
But the source really singles out his treatment of the real Earl of Warwick.
It does. Young Prince Simnel had impersonated.
Calling it a striking example of tyranny.
Yes, Warwick wasn't really a threat, but Henry kept him locked up and then after Warbeck's plot, had him executed. The source seems to view this as going too far. Not just security, but, well, a tyrannical act against an innocent person really highlights Henry's ruthless side.
And that sense of calculation, that ruthlessness, it seems to carry over into his governing style too. Focusing on power and, crucially, wealth.
Absolutely. The source calls his parliament obsequious.
Obsequious, that's a strong word. What's the implication there?
Well, it suggests Parliament wasn't really acting as an independent check on the king. It was more like a tool for his will.
Especially for things like passing attainders, condemning opponents without trial.
Precisely, and seizing their property. It shows the power balance was tilted very firmly towards the monarch then.
And the source uses an equally strong phrase for his money-making tactics. Arts of chicanery.
Yes, arts of chicanery. It talks about heavy fines, using arbitrary courts, commissioners.
It highlights that case of Sir William Cable.
It does. Fined over 1,615 on penal statutes. The source specifically calls this a precedent, sort of setting the stage for exploiting laws for financial gain later on.
So it wasn't just standard taxes. The source implies these were manipulative, maybe even dishonest ways to get money?
That's the strong suggestion, yes. Beyond just wealth, though, he also strategically reshaped the social structure.
How so?
The source says he depressed the old nobility, partly by really cracking down on laws against them, keeping private armies, retainers.
And how did that impact them, according to the source?
It pushed them towards competing in different ways. What the source calls a civilized species of emulation, basically. showing off with splendor and elegance rather than military might.
A different kind of power display.
Exactly. And at the same time, he exalted lawyers, tied authority more to the laws and the bureaucracy that he controlled. It's a fundamental shift in who held influence.
And the source even throws in some surprising economic details from the time.
It does, like regulated prices for cloth, scarlet at 26 shillings a yard, colored cloth at 18 shillings.
And wages.
Daily wages for tradesmen, like masons, were nearly 10 pence a day. The source notes these seemed high even back then.
And connects it to the discovery of the West Indies. That's fascinating.
Yeah, linking rising labor and commodity costs to global exploration. It also touches on failed attempts to regulate enclosure and depopulation by law.
Suggesting natural improvement was the eventual fix.
Sort of, yeah. And it notes a check on industry from corporations, things like that.
Okay, shifting to foreign policy. The source shows Henry focused on securing peace through strategic marriages.
These connections were really crucial for stability. He married his daughter Margaret to James V of Scotland.
And there's that famous story the source mentions.
Oh, right. His counselors worried England might end up falling under Scottish rule through the marriage.
And Henry's reply.
No, Scotland will fall under England. The source clearly admires his foresight there, predicting the eventual union. Quite shrewd.
And his second son, the future Henry VIII, was contracted to Catherine of Aragon.
Arthur's widow, his elder son.
Yes. And this required a papal dispensation.
Which the source very pointedly notes was afterwards attended with the most important consequences. Talk about foreshadowing.
Definitely sets the stage. So, summing up Henry VII, the source paints him as practical, policy-driven.
Often putting his own advantage first, maybe?
Yes, but it does acknowledge improvements in things like policing and commerce during his reign.
So while he was severe, calculating, using force and these questionable financial methods, the source seems to respect his shrewdness. He secured a very shaky throne, quite effectively countered enemies, and managed the levers of power, like Parliament.
Which leads us straight to the next generation. The transition to his son, Henry VIII, was, well, remarkably smooth.
And initially, the source suggests there were hopes for a more, maybe, impartial rule.
But those hopes quickly got tangled up with the rise of one man, Thomas Wolsey.
His rise was just meteoric. Staggering, really.
The source lists his positions: Privy Seal, Chamberlain, Archbishop of York,
Bishop of Tournai, Cardinal, and crucially, Legato a Latere. That last one gave him immense church power directly from the Pope, but within England.
And the wealth that came with it, described as nearly equal to the crown's own revenue.
Almost, fueled by all these positions, pensions. And the source makes a point that his lifestyle wasn't just grand, it was ostentatious.
Giving widespread offense.
Exactly. Offending people, even lessening respect for the young king. This lavish display is flagged as a real source of public discontent.
And there's that great detail about Bishop Fox warning Henry VIII.
Yes, Fox, who'd served Henry VII, wisely cautioned the young king not to suffer the servant to be greater than his master. Sound advice.
But Henry VIII, young and confident,
brushed it off, deferred to Wolsey, and this really sets the stage for Wolsey's huge influence, especially in foreign affairs.
Right. Henry VIII was keen to get involved in Europe, wasn't he? Often driven by that old English sentiment against France.
Definitely. The source mentions early alliances against Venice, then joining forces against France with the Pope, Spain, Emperor Maximilian.
And that amazing detail about Emperor Maximilian serving under Henry at the Siege of Terouanne.
It's quite something, isn't it? The source notes Maximilian actually got paid as one of Henry's captains.
Wow.
It really underscores the shifting alliances, maybe Henry's ambition to be seen as a major European player, though the source hints Wolsey might have flattered him into these expensive wars.
And Tournai was captured and given to Wolsey himself.
Yes, further cementing his power and wealth, all tied up in these foreign ventures.
So Wolsey was pretty much running the show for the young king, home and abroad.
Effectively, yes. And his own ambition, like wanting to become pope, is noted as a key driver.
And it's this ambition, this control, that becomes central to the huge turning point of Henry's reign, what the source calls the king's great matter.
The divorce, or rather the annulment from Catherine of Aragon.
The source frames the core issue around that biblical text, Leviticus.
Right, about marrying a brother's widow. And the whole debate over whether the papal dispensation Pope Julius II had granted was even valid, or if it could override divine law.
But the real driver, the source suggests, was the desperate need for a male heir.
Clearly, Catherine had only given him Mary.
And, of course, the growing influence of Anne Boleyn.
And her powerful family connections, like the Norfolks, that added significant political weight to the situation.
So Wolsey was tasked with getting the annulment from Pope Clement VII.
And he failed spectacularly. The source lays out the Pope's impossible position.
He was basically a prisoner of Emperor Charles V.
Pretty much. And Charles was Catherine's nephew, so he wasn't going to allow the annulment. Plus, the Pope had his own priorities, like restoring the Medici in Florence.
And he didn't want to undermine papal authority by overturning a previous pope's bull.
Right. So Clement just stalled. Cardinal Campeggio was sent over.
Arrived late, full of delay.
Exactly. And then, the killer blow. Under secret orders from the Pope, Campeggio burned the crucial decretal bull.
The one that would have let the legates in England make the final call.
Yes. That pulled the rug right out from under Wolsey.
And the source notes Anne Boleyn and others immediately blamed Wolsey for the failure.
Which led directly to his downfall. And the source highlights the irony.
That he was charged for obtaining the legatine power Henry himself had allowed him to use.
Precisely. He fell from grace, was arrested, and died soon after, apparently broken by it all.
So, with the Pope route blocked, the source describes a new tactic emerging the expedient.
Consulting the European universities on the legality of the marriage. Gardner and Fox get the credit for that idea, according to the text.
And it pointedly says the universities were swayed. What's the implication there?
It strongly suggests the opinions weren't purely objective or academic. There was likely pressure, maybe bribes.
So the opinions weren't impartial judgments?
Probably not. More like useful justifications for Henry, rather than neutral legal advice.
With these opinions in hand, Henry then turned to Parliament.
As the instrument for the break with Rome, key laws were passed.
Forbidding appeals to Rome.
Imposing those harsh penalties of praemunire on anyone supporting the Pope.
Forfeiting goods, losing legal protection.
Yeah. And later, making it treason for office holders to refuse an oath denying the Pope's authority.
And there was that controversial move where Parliament discharged the king's debts.
Yes, the source notes this caused widespread complaints. It seemed to primarily target friends of Wolsey who'd lent the king money.
So another example of Henry using Parliament for his own ends, leveraging Wolsey's fall.
It looks that way, according to the source. The culmination, of course, was Henry declaring himself supreme head of the church in England.
And Archbishop Cranmer then formally declared the marriage to Catherine null and void.
Citing the evidence and those university opinions.
And the Pope reacted by nullifying Cranmer's sentence, threatening excommunication.
But by then, Henry had consolidated control, backed by Parliament. The break was effectively done.
But the religious landscape under Henry, it wasn't straightforwardly Protestant, was it?
Not at all. The source shows Henry dictating doctrine himself. Things like the institution of a Christian man, the King's Book.
But he also rigorously enforced core Catholic doctrines with that severe act of the 6 Articles.
Absolutely. Upholding things like the real presence, clerical celibacy, very Catholic in substance.
And persecution wasn't just for denying those Catholic doctrines.
No. The source highlights the executions of Bishop Fisher and Sir Thomas More.
For denying the king's supremacy.
Exactly. And the source explicitly calls punishing them for what was essentially a political opinion, a high instance of tyranny.
That phrase, high instance of tyranny, is powerful. Why does the source use that specifically for them?
It seems to see it as crossing a line. Fisher and More weren't plotting rebellion. They were executed for holding a belief about the Pope's authority that contradicted the king's new claim.
A matter of conscience, really.
Right. So the source portrays it as the king using treason laws to crush dissent on a matter of belief or political opinion, arbitrary, tyrannical power.
One of the biggest consequences of the break. The dissolution of the monasteries.
Yes. It started with the smaller ones, based on reports of misconduct from commissioners.
But the source is skeptical about those reports.
It questions their impartiality, yeah. Noting they were probably biased, given the king wanted a pretext for abolition anyway.
So the accusations, misconduct, lewdness, even murder, they might have been exaggerated.
The source frames them as potentially exaggerated claims used to justify the whole thing. It seems skeptical of the official reasons given.
Presenting the reports as maybe part of the plan.
That's the implication. The monastic property was transferred to the crown. Later, the larger monasteries went too, often through forced surrenders or accusing abbots of treason.
And the source mentions efforts to discredit monastic practices.
Yes, defaming relics, superstitions, like publicly showing how the Boxley root of grace worked, its mechanics, trying to make it all look like fraud.
What about the financial outcome? Did Henry get rich?
Less than he hoped, apparently. The source says the monks saw it coming and hid assets, so the loot from stock, furniture, plate wasn't as huge as expected.
And the social impact?
Well, the end of monastic hospitality. That had traditionally supported, decayed gentlemen, the poor.
A kind of safety net gone.
Right. Contributing to idleness, maybe, because the king didn't set up enough alternatives. And many clergy lost their positions and income.
On the other side of things, the source mentions English Bibles becoming available.
Yes, though not smoothly. It recounts Bishop Tunstall burning Tyndale's translation.
Which the source calls absurd.
Yes, suggesting it just served the clergy who wanted to keep scripture locked away in Latin to maintain their own control.
Despite Henry's immense power, there was resistance, wasn't there?
Oh, yes. The Pilgrimage of Grace, a big rebellion up north.
Caused by the dissolution.
That, combined with other grievances, the source says, it was eventually put down, and the leaders like Aske and Lord Darcy were executed.
As Henry's reign went on, the source seems to paint him as increasingly tyrannical.
It definitely notes his use of attainders without trial, cites the tragic case of the Duke of Norfolk and his son, the Earl of Surrey, right near the end of Henry's life.
And his volatile temper, bringing down ministers like Cromwell.
Yes. And, of course, the turbulent fates of his later wives, which the source also covers.
Parliament also granted him incredible power through the Succession Act.
Setting the line through Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, but the source emphasizes the extraordinary powers given to Henry personally.
Like repealing laws made before he was 24.
Exactly. And reinforcing penalties for papal support. It really cemented his authority to reshape laws and succession however he wanted.
So Henry's legacy, according to this source, is complex.
Very. It acknowledges improvements, policing, commerce, patronage of arts. But it hammers home his severe tyrannical nature.
Yet it concludes his personal charisma that frankness, generosity, magnificence somehow counterbalanced the cruelty for his subjects.
Kept them in awe, perhaps, and his vigorous foreign policy played well with English pride. A contradictory figure for sure.
A reign defined by breaking with Rome, consolidating power, and, well, significant personal tyranny. Which brings us to his young son, Edward VI.
Yes, coming to the throne as a boy king, described by the source as pious, intelligent.
And inclined towards religious severity.
Yes, that's noted.
With a minor on the throne, power fell to the Regency Council.
Specifically to Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset. He became protector, overriding Henry VIII's plan for the council.
Which caused problems right away.
Yes. The source notes immediate opposition from other councillors who felt sidelined.
Under Somerset, the source shows the Reformation really picking up speed.
Significant changes. Crucially, the repeal of the harsh act of the 6 Articles and those old treason laws that only needed 1 witness.
The source notes the Commons added the 2-witness rule later.
It does. And the law making royal proclamations equal to statutes was also repealed. The source calls this a destruction of laws.
Destruction of laws.
Yeah.
That sounds quite negative. What's the meaning there?
It's a bit startling, but in context, it seems to mean destroying laws seen as overly harsh or giving the monarch too much arbitrary power.
So dismantling Henry VIII's more severe laws.
Exactly, moving toward a slightly more defined legal framework, even if heresy itself remained a capital crime.
Okay, that makes more sense. And the religious changes.
Removing images, old ceremonies, introducing the first Book of Common Prayer. Big shifts.
But Somerset faced challenges, even from his own brother.
Thomas Seymour, the admiral, intensely ambitious.
Married Henry VIII's widow, Catherine Parr.
Secretly, yes. Sought influence over young Edward, maybe even had designs on Princess Elizabeth. The source mentions him trying to build support arm of force.
Claiming he could raise 10,000 men.
Yes, securing arms, getting funds from a corrupt mint master, all very suspect.
And he was brought down by an attainder without a formal trial, like under Henry VII.
Yes, the source describes it as harsh. Parliament passed the bill after hearing accusations, but Seymour wasn't there to confront witnesses. Shows that tool of summary condemnation was still very much in use.
Meanwhile, there was a lot of social and economic unrest during Edward's reign.
Widespread stuff, fueled by enclosure of common lands, rising rents.
Leading to major rebellions. Kett's Rebellion in Norfolk.
And the one in Devonshire, where social issues were explicitly linked to anger about the religious changes.
The source notes Somerset seems sympathetic to the poor, but this actually hurt him. Why?
Well, in that context, sympathy probably meant he wasn't seen as being tough enough on the rebels or wasn't protecting the interests of the landowners, the gentry.
Who benefited from enclosure.
Right. So his lack of decisive action against the rebels angered the very people whose support he needed, turning the council against him.
And foreign affairs were still a problem.
The war with Scotland dragged on. Somerset won a victory at Pinkie, but French support for Scotland complicated everything. Eventually, they had to abandon fortifications like Haddington.
So Somerset's position weakened, leading to his fall.
The source puts it down to his growing pride, neglecting relationships with other councillors. John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, led the opposition.
Somerset confessed, lost office, but then tried to ally with Warwick.
Briefly, yes. Even a marriage between their children. Warwick's son, Guilford Dudley, married Somerset's daughter, Jane Seymour.
That connection becomes important later.
Very. But Somerset's return didn't last. His final downfall came with more accusations, a second arrest.
A spy involved, Sir Thomas Palmer.
Yes, the source mentions Palmer provided incriminating info. Somerset was tried for treason and felony. Acquitted of treason.
But condemned for felony based on intention.
Right, and executed, despite some public sympathy. The source notes Northumberland's people worked hard to turn the young king against his uncle and restricted access. Political maneuvering behind the scenes.
With Somerset gone, Warwick, now Duke of Northumberland, took control.
The source describes him as pretty indifferent to religion personally, but he backed the reformers for political gain. Accumulated titles.
And arranged that crucial marriage. His son, Guilford Dudley, to Lady Jane Grey.
Daughter of the new Duke of Suffolk. Yes, which sets the stage for that desperate final act of Edward's reign.
The attempt to change the succession.
Northumberland manipulating the dying Edward VI to name Lady Jane Grey as his heir.
Bypassing Mary and Elizabeth, Henry VIII's designated successors confirmed by Parliament.
Exactly. The source details the immense pressure on judges and councillors to sign the patent, their protests that it was illegal, treasonous.
But they eventually complied, under duress.
Reluctantly, yes. The source ends the section lamenting Edward's early death, praising his qualities: mild disposition, intelligence, judgment.
Notes his religious severity, but maybe tempered by Protestant principles compared to Catholic ones?
That's the suggestion. A brief reign, then. Rapid religious change under a protectorate, social upheaval, and this dramatic, failed attempt to subvert the succession right at the end.
Which brings us to Mary II.
And her accession, the source presents as surprisingly smooth compared to the others.
Her claim was clear, wasn't it?
Yes, straightforward. And the nation's support just swept aside Northumberland's plot. He, Lady Jane Grey, Guilford Dudley, swiftly imprisoned.
And as a devout Catholic, her first priority was restoring the old religion.
No time wasted. Releasing and restoring prominent Catholics like Gardiner, Bonner, Tunstall to power immediately.
Her relationship with her half-sister Elizabeth was famously difficult.
Deeply difficult. The source ties it right back to their mother's rivalry. Mary saw Elizabeth as illegitimate, especially after Parliament had revalidated Catherine of Aragon's marriage.
And Elizabeth's perceived Protestantism was a major issue for Mary's strong Catholic faith.
A profound offense, yes. Then came the critical question of who Mary should marry.
Several options, but the really controversial choice was Philip of Spain.
Son of Emperor Charles V. Huge opposition in England compared to potential English candidates like Courtenay.
Why such strong opposition to Philip?
Intense fears of foreign domination, basically. Spanish influence. The source mentions Gardiner supported it, though, for political and religious reasons.
And Charles V advised Mary to go carefully with religious changes before the marriage.
Wisely, yes. To try and calm English nerves.
But despite the opposition, the Spanish marriage went ahead, sparking Wyatt's rebellion.
Directly triggered by those fears about the marriage and the religious policies. It failed, though.
But the consequences were tragic, especially for Lady Jane Grey and her husband. They weren't involved in Wyatt's plot, were they?
No, but the source notes Mary, despite hesitating earlier, decided to execute them after the rebellion, saw them as too dangerous a symbol for future trouble.
Her father, Suffolk, also executed. Throgmorton acquitted.
Yes. And Princess Elizabeth was imprisoned, suspected, but nothing was proven against her.
Parliament under Mary quickly started undoing Edward's reforms.
Repealed his religious laws, restored the Mass, and significantly made heresy a capital crime again.
But there was some resistance in Parliament, refusing subsidies.
Yes, the source notes some instances, refusing certain subsidies or measures against religious exiles. It also mentions Philip using huge bribes, 400,000 crowns, to influence Parliament.
Calling it a pernicious practice new to England, the source seems quite critical.
It does, highlighting this large-scale foreign money swaying votes as a corrupting, maybe unprecedented influence on the English Parliament.
What about the big issue of the church lands from the dissolution?
Ah, yes. A major sticking point for the landowners. The source notes Mary even temporarily kept the title Supreme Head of the Church to ease fears about this.
Parliament insisted the landholders keep the former monastic lands.
Absolutely. And Cardinal Pole had to ratify this when England was reconciled to Rome. So papal authority was restored in spiritual matters, but crucially, the property rights of the laity who'd gained those lands were protected, a key compromise.
This brings us to the defining and most harrowing part of Mary's reign in this source, the persecutions.
Yes, the source described the policy of burning Protestants as driven by the cruel bigotry of Mary and Philip.
Contrasting it with potentially less violent options.
Yes, like banishment or silence, suggested by Gardiner, even Emperor Charles V advised against violence.
The source names specific martyrs: Rogers, Hooper, Taylor, Philpott, Cranmer.
Describing their suffering and constancy as very similar across the board. It uses incredibly strong language.
Savage barbarity and patient constancy.
Yes, and the narrative views this whole period as showing human nature at its most detestable and at the same time so absurd.
That phrase, detestable and at the same time so absurd. What's the source getting at there?
It seems to capture both the moral horror of the violence detestable, but also sees the underlying rationale as fundamentally irrational, self-defeating, absurd.
Because burning people didn't actually work.
Exactly. It created martyrs, it hardened resistance, it didn't stamp out Protestantism. The source sees the absolute certainty, the willingness to use such extreme violence for religious truth as both morally repellent and ultimately futile.
So morally wrong and politically ineffective in the source's view.
That's the clear takeaway.
Foreign policy didn't go well either under Mary.
No. Philip pressured England into his war against France against the advice of counselors like Pole,
leading directly to the loss of Calais.
England's last foothold on the continent, a huge blow to national pride, very humiliating.
In her final years, Mary sounds increasingly unhappy.
And severe, yes. Personal disappointments, that phantom pregnancy, Philip's absences likely played a part. Her unpopularity grew, and she responded by cracking down harder with the persecutions.
So summing up Mary's character and legacy from this source?
Her reign is just defined by that violent attempt to restore Catholicism and the brutal persecutions. The source is adamant it failed to kill Protestantism and, ironically, actually strengthened English resistance to papal authority, especially over property.
The source also adds those interesting little details about daily life, houses of wattling and clay, straw beds, wooden utensils.
And the first general highway law passed in her reign. Small things, but they offer a different glimpse.
Grounding details amidst all the high drama.
Exactly.
So we've journeyed through 3 incredibly different reigns, each shaped by contested claims, ambitious ministers, deep religious conviction, and intense personal struggles.
From Henry VIII's careful, calculating consolidation of power, to Edward VI's brief reformist rule under a protectorate, to Mary's attempt to violently wrench England back to Catholicism.
You really see how quickly power could shift and how deeply those religious differences affected everything: policy, succession, daily life.
The source really brings out a time of immense uncertainty. Succession was fragile, alliances constantly shifting, and just what you believed could literally cost you everything: property, freedom, even your life.
So looking back at this period through the lens of this particular source, what does it all mean for you listening now? How did these struggles over legitimacy, Parliament's role, religious truth, the limits of royal power, how did they lay the groundwork for the England that came next?
And maybe consider this. In an age where truth can often feel flexible, debated, what happens when a ruler, like Mary I in this account, believes with absolute unwavering certainty that their interpretation of divine law is the only one?
And is willing to enforce it with extreme violence. What is the source's judgment of that, calling it detestable and absurd? Tell us about the consequences when that kind of faith collides with absolute power. Something to think about.